panel with Amy and Kirti, who, as they present, they'll also introduce themselves. But I'm going to quickly share my screen to take you through what we have in store today and then dive into the discussion. So I hope you can see my screen, Amy. Can I look to you?
It's coming. There we go. Yeah.
Great. And so today, with many thanks to Namrata for kind of setting the stage for us, we're going to be talking a little bit about what really is digital public infrastructure, or DPI. And then Amy is going to talk about really the core of what we're proposing, which is these complementing building blocks specific to the agriculture sector. And then Kirti is going to bring her country experience to talk a little bit about the implementations of this. We'll follow that by a short panel discussion and then a Q&A, which will be open to all. So before we dive into the agenda, I wanted to provide a sneak peek into what is in store next month. And so we are producing a new white paper on the digital public infrastructure approach for the agriculture sector. And putting this together has really been an exercise in collaboration and technical nuances, as Namrata discussed. And I'd like to start by, of course, thanking our drafting partners, Vital Wave, Gates Foundation, Co-Develop, COSS, and OAN, for their true collaboration on this, but also several individuals and organizations for their contributions. And really and truly, this has been a collaborative effort, because the idea was to strengthen this collective understanding of DPI for the agriculture sector. So what is DPI? What are these foundational set of systems that can be used in the agriculture sector? And how these DPI principles or characteristics can also help design digital systems in the agriculture sector. And then, like I mentioned, it's been a collaboration across many organizations, and we're set to launch this next month in the Africa Food Systems Forum early next month. So before we talk about how we can use DPI for the agriculture sector, I want to speak a little bit about what really is DPI and what is this DPI approach, and also what could be its value in the agriculture sector. So we know digital agriculture solutions are not new to the sector, and there have been some successes in this regard, but they've also not taken off at a foundational or a whole of society level as much as maybe one would have wanted. And so with the current landscape of solutions, we often find either fragmented data systems, duplicated efforts, specific implementations for a specific problem, uncoordinated governance, limited or concentrated market sizes, and often digital tools are linked to high costs. And now, especially in a world where food security is becoming increasingly important with the growing population, we're also focused on how to ensure productivity increases while being mindful of resources. This jump in productivity of the agriculture sector becomes vital, and digital tools can play a role here. So this new approach, which has gained a lot of momentum, is around an approach called digital public infrastructure. So as many of you probably know, DPI is an emerging and nascent topic, but also a trending one. And so as a result of this, there are several definitions and interpretations of what DPI is, with different organizations presenting slightly different ideas or highlighting different nuances, as you can see on this slide, from the G20 definition to UNDP definition, co-developed CDPI, and the World Bank. So the World Bank recently published a paper this year that aims to kind of simplify and provide a collective definition. And it defines DPI as a systems that serve as foundational digital building blocks for public benefit. The paper provides a detailed set of characteristics, as shown in the first figure, which kind of relate to the scope, specifications, and norms for DPI, which define what can be referred to as DPI. Now, in this session, I don't really want to go into much detail on the nuances of what is a DPI, but to say, in a sense, traditionally, digital systems have been built in silos, with each ministry or department creating, for example, its own database or platform. And this often leads to duplication, higher cost, and fragmented experiences in data systems for both citizens and government. And so this DPI approach essentially changes this. It's thinking about, instead of separate systems for each department, building of shared foundational railroads that everyone can use. And so, for example, rather than every agency collecting biometric data, you can have a single foundational ID which can serve multiple purposes, from health to education to agriculture, and social protection and so on. So, how is DPI really able to do this? What makes it unique in terms of the various digital solutions that have been around? And to answer this, we wanted to highlight four key characteristics that define what DPI is. So first, DPI systems are foundational, which mean they're relevant across society, not just for one sector. And if you're thinking about, for example, biometric data being collected by different departments, it can be replaced by one foundational ID system, which can serve this purpose across different departments and use cases. Second, they're designed as building blocks. And so they're these minimalistic, interoperable, and reusable building blocks. You can think of it almost as a Lego, where each block just serves one purpose, but together they can be much larger than the sum of the parts as well. And so you're building on one another, which each part just focused on a single purpose, and together they can have more impact. Then the third is around a public good orientation, which emphasizes accountability, inclusion, and trust. And finally, DPI is also an enabler of innovation and outcomes at scale. So the idea here is, by laying the foundation, it allows government and private sector to build atop of the DPI railroads, accelerating innovation and service delivery. So we've spoken a lot about the characteristics of what makes a DPI, but we also wanted to look at what are the specific systems that we are talking about here. Now, some of these systems are fairly well established, like digital IDs, and you can think of, Aadhaar in India, Mesha number in Kenya, or e-Estonia in Estonia. Then you have fast and inclusive payment systems like Brazil's Pix or India's UPI. You have trust frameworks like consent protocols or digital signatures. And you also have data exchange platforms or data sharing capabilities, depending on the context you're looking at. But there are also a set of systems that are emerging, because, of course, this is a space that's constantly evolving. And so for capabilities such as discovery and fulfillment systems, this could be to connect buyers and sellers, or foundational data services such as weather and geospatial interoperable data. And increasingly now, language localization models, especially powered by uh, the huge rise in AI over the past few years. And so these are kind of the systems that we commonly think of as DPI. So ID payments, data sharing, trust frameworks being the more established ones, and then a few new ones that are coming into play. And then, so the real question for us today is, how can this DPI approach both these characteristics, principles we just covered, but also the systems that we have seen, be applied to agriculture? And we think there are two main ways that this can happen. First, agriculture can leverage existing foundational DPI. And here, for example, national IDs can be used for targeting agriculture subsidies, or digital payment systems can ensure farmers receive credit or input transfers directly, on time, in a convenient manner. And so this is basically taking the foundational DPI systems and saying, how can we leverage this for an agriculture use case? So you have the digital ID, national digital ID, digital payments, trust framework, and so on. And how can we just utilize it in the agriculture space? And the second means to do this, which Amy will talk about in more detail, is building sector-specific building blocks to complement and sit atop the foundational DPI systems. And these building blocks can also follow many of the characteristics that define DPI. So they can be interoperable, minimalistic, for public good, and so on. And these together create a strong backbone for the digital agriculture economy, but also for the citizens and the welfare of people. So with this, I'll actually hand over to Amy, who will go into more detail on the meat of this. So Amy, over to you, and I'll keep the slides going. Just let me know when you want me to switch.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Nidhi, and thanks everyone for being here this morning. As Namrata mentioned, my name is Amy Paul. I am the Senior Director of Professional Services at Vital Wave. And again, as was mentioned, it's really been a pleasure working on this together. So I'm going to pick up where Nidhi left off and just re-emphasize one or two things because I think it's really important and always helpful to hear them a couple of times. So foundational DPI, right, as Nidhi very nicely just laid out, is really about cross-sectoral relevance, right, and shifting away from that kind of siloed model within different sectors to using shared components that can be utilized for use cases across sectors. But when we think about, a particular community within a sector, saying that's all great, but I work in the agriculture sector, like how does this make a difference for what I can do? And I think that it's particularly important to think about how we can use those foundational components, but also recognizing that there is often just as much fragmentation within sectors as there are across them, right? And so the value of bringing this DPI approach is in how can you um, get that same benefit in terms of limiting fragmentation within a sector so that you're not in the case of having 10 different or 12 different or many more different farmer registries, right, that don't all have congruent information in them to be able to get the benefit of those solutions. So in this section, we're really, this work here was really about how do we extend that DPI approach into a sector and think about how it can both address that fragmentation within the sector and also get the benefit of the foundational components that are emerging in different countries as part of foundational DPI. So go ahead and go to the next slide. You got a little preview there, but basically what we're talking about here is just adding an additional layer of components that really help you leverage that foundational DPI and can help address some of the fragmentation within the sector. And again, just to be really clear here, I think, there's some we're not talking about replacing or kind of creating another version of DPI systems within the sector. It's really about saying what additional systems or what additional components that operate as independent systems are needed to really leverage that, right? So if you have a really great national ID system, as you do in India, it's not the same or it's not sufficient to also be your farmer registry, to also have your farmer ID. You need an additional system, right, that's going to have that specific information about the farmer layered on top of that. And so what we're talking about then is building this ecosystem where you've got your foundational components that Nidhi very nicely laid out, and you've got some additional components, which is what we're calling sector-specific building blocks on top of that, that together create this ecosystem in which you can build any number of different digital solutions. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So what that would look like just graphically in terms of this ecosystem, right, is what you saw before on the bottom with having your technology and your foundational DPI. And this green layer in the middle is really where we're going to focus for the next few minutes of trying to unpack what those sector-specific components are, with the idea that together you're going to have, a dynamic kind of layer of services and applications that can be used for all number of things. And across the top here, we've just tried to highlight that these kinds of solutions, although we often talk about farmer-facing solutions, really have value across an ecosystem of stakeholders, whether they are particular farmer-facing solutions, whether we're talking about traceability and supply chain integrity, whether we're talking about innovation opportunities and things that are going to be useful for agribusinesses, or just efficient subsidy delivery, the ability to make decisions with more information. This really is something, again, going back to that idea of whole of society benefit that DPI is meant to enable. So we're going to work our way through this graphic, and starting here at the bottom, you can just keep track of where we are in the upper right. But this should look very familiar, right? This is precisely what Nidhi just went over. And again, we're recognizing that, not all countries are going to have all of these components in place at the same time, but the idea is where they exist, right? Or we're trying to be able to leverage what's already there as more and more countries develop different foundational level components, these will be added to the ecosystem. If we advance up one layer, again, we've got a couple of different categories here. And one thing to notice right off the bat is that, again, there's not every category in a specific sector as you have in the foundational level, right? There really are some things that we're saying don't necessarily have that sectoral nuance. For example, you don't see an ag-specific payment system here, right? And that's by design, right? Like there's nothing specific about that that requires tailoring for the sector. What we've tried to pull out here are building blocks that do have some nuance, right? That do have some additional information for the sector that may not be relevant across the board, but really are important for addressing that intrasectoral fragmentation. So just to start on the left here, we've got registries, right? And that is, again, a very common component that you see in the foundational level. And what we mean by a sector-specific one is just how are you tailoring that for the sector, right? What are examples of these kinds of shared resources that would really add value on top of a national identity system, for example, and allow you to do things like issue farmer IDs to be able to target subsidies based on particular crop boundaries or crops grown. So these are all very familiar. This is not exhaustive. There may be many different types of registries beyond what we've listed here, but just to give a sense of recognizing that there's a large amount of data that needs to be organized in registries to be able to use across the sector. The second category in yellow there, oops, if you can just go back one slide. Thanks, Nidhi. The second category in yellow for agricultural data standards, data exchange protocols, and standard vocabularies really does a lot of work in this framework, right? This is the kind, this is the category of building block that really enables that data exchange to happen in a way that is so often frustrating for those working in the sector, right? It's like even if people have data, it's not necessarily in the same format. People might be using different formats. You might have some fields that are structured and some that aren't, and still require you to go back and do some cleaning or augmentation. And so the idea here is really thinking about for people using data in the sector and the nuance and the detail of that sector, what are the standards and protocols and standard vocabularies that allow you to all allow that data to flow seamlessly. And so these are kind of emerging. We see versions of this in different sectors. Just to give an example, like in the health sector, some of you may be familiar with the Fast Health Interoperability Resource, which is an emerging standard in the health sector, again, designed to deal with some of the nuance of that sector's data. And so we're talking about something equivalent in the ag sector. We can talk more about Agri-JSON, but there's just, again, additional levels of detail that aren't necessarily handled well by generic data formats and standards. The third category in teal there might sound similar, but we thought it was important to call out because there are so many use cases that draw on data for the agricultural sector that aren't necessarily personal farmer data. If you want to use pest and disease surveillance data, for example, or soil maps or market data, things that aren't traditionally found in, a registry, but are equally important to have in a standard format to be able to access, through an API, to have some sort of confidence in the quality and curation of that data. And so as we see systems for data exchange emerge that kind of offer these added benefits of having data available through API that have somebody kind of looking at it on a regular basis, that's another category of building block that we called out. And then lastly, as Nidhi mentioned, emerging assets for AI. Again, this might sometimes look the same as different data sets, but this is really about multimodal content. So it could be voice data, could be video or photo data, having it labeled in ways that make sense. Also having potentially what are called small language models, so building things that build in the vernacular of agriculture language that are able for use, particularly for the emerging advisory types of use cases in the sector. So again, not exhaustive, not everyone's going to have these, but that's a flavor of what we're talking about as building blocks. And then what this enables you to do is as we move up to the top layer, in the kind of coral color at the top is just to see a set of different use cases here that combine both that foundational DPI building block and the sector-specific ones to be the core of different types of solutions. So again, you can kind of get the idea here. We're extending this Lego analogy, but the idea is in most of these applications, right, you're using some combination of foundational and sector-specific building block. I think you see those specific yellow, the data exchange kinds of assets showing up across all of these, again, just emphasizing how important that is. But some of the ones that we've called out here are ones, again, that we heard over and over again as being key for the sector, whether that's being able to link different data sets together about farmers and get really rich farmer profiles, the ability to use your kind of foundational payment system alongside the agriculture-specific data for digital agri-finance and thinking about different credit scoring modalities or different ability to make input or loan payments. Traceability is a big one, again, for supply chains and thinking about some of the emerging requirements in the EU and being able to track products throughout the value chain. Again, thinking about specific traceability standards, potentially bringing in some of that other core data around the sector. For market discovery and fulfillment, again, we're losing lots of different things here depending on what that looks like. If you are actually building a market platform through which you can make transactions, you're going to have the financial component of the foundational layer, along with a lot of the sector-specific data as well. And again, if we're talking about an AI-enabled advisory services or just an AI-enabled transactions, you're going to be using some of those building blocks that are AI-specific. So again, this is not meant to be prescriptive, right? We're going to see variations on here, but the idea here is just to show how for almost all of these use cases that are valued for the sector, there's going to be combinations of foundational and sector-specific things that are important. And the idea is not that they replace each other, but that they work together in this broader ecosystem. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is just, if you go back, what that looks like all together. Again, nothing new here. We've walked through it, but just to kind of see how we're kind of building out each of these layers, again, recognizing that not every country will have all of these at the same time, but conceptually, when you have these things present in the ecosystem, you're creating the foundation for all kinds of solutions to be developed. Okay, now you can go to the next slide. So again, just to emphasize, why are we doing this? Why do we want this approach? Nidhi spent some time in the beginning talking about some of the benefits. And I think it's important just to reiterate what this looks like when we're using a DPI-enabled systems, because it is possible to develop these solutions in a bespoke way, right? It's not that there has never been a particular registry or there's never been a traceability product, but the problem comes when that's siloed or when it doesn't scale. And so there's a difference, the DPI approach is not really about the specific solutions that are developed, but really about the approach and the common components that underlie them. And so when we look at, just contrasting quickly what it looks like to do this in a DPI-enabled way versus a siloed way, we're talking about for farmer-facing solutions, continued access, right? It doesn't depend on the length of a particular project or which partner or how long that project runs. You've got kind of a shared component that's there as part of the infrastructure that can be continually accessed. Streamlined eligibility, meaning you enter your data once and you don't have to redo it again with each different scheme. That's part of a common database. And just access to broader and more competitive markets rather than having access only to a smaller subset that might be participating again with a particular program or might share some more bespoke standard or common component. For aggregators and off-takers, this is about greater visibility, right? Having all of these different products being able to share information such that you have a much more comprehensive view of what's going on, to be able to plan, to be able to reduce risk, experiencing streamlined compliance procedures, given widespread use of data standards for traceability or supply chain management, And just having improved competition, right? Given that there's more of this market data being exchanged, you have greater visibility into pricing and amounts and allows uh, more leverage across the ecosystem for better competition. For innovators, I think this is a big one. We're talking about reusing common components. So there's a reduced need to build from scratch and having to recreate things each time you want to build a new solution that theoretically should allow innovation to happen faster, to scale more easily, to allow collaboration across a wider group of stakeholders. And then for governments, again, having access to that foundational data continuously to be able to make more informed policy decisions, to experience cost savings by utilizing that shared payments infrastructure, by having more complete registry information and being able to weed out fraud and be more efficient in the kinds of benefits that are delivered. There's some nice emerging research looking at some of the actual cost benefit that comes from this as well. And then lastly, or lastly for me, just wanting to give a little sense of where this is happening. And I think, you all may be more familiar with more examples than are on this page, but just to say that this is starting to happen, right? This isn't entirely theoretical. We see examples for different ones of these use cases across the globe. From looking at traceability in Honduras, there's some nice examples across particularly coffee value chains. There are examples, many in India that we'll hear from our colleague in a moment. Also in countries that don't necessarily have foundational DPI. So Lao PDR is one example where the group Open SBP is working on registries somewhat out ahead of having strong foundational DPI and building it in ways that it ought to be able to connect with that in the future when that comes along, right? They're an example of thinking about how do you build for a future ecosystem given where they're currently sitting. So just wanting to give a flavor of where these are at. I think I'll pause now and turn it over to Gurjeet to talk a little bit more about experiences in India.
Thank you, Amy. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirti, and I lead the Open AgriNet mission in India and across the global south, actually. Like Nidhi and Amy mentioned, DPI have conventionally been believed to be the foundational infrastructure which are sector agnostic, be it identities, payment interface, exchange layer, or trust layer. I think in the last couple of years, the feeling has come that we need to have sector specific DPIs because the requirements of each sector are quite nuanced. Amy mentioned about the example of healthcare, so did Nidhi. Both of them covered healthcare and agriculture. I will cover the agriculture sector because that is what Open AgriNet is responsible for. We are promoting a DPI plus AI approach to digital agriculture. And frankly, when we started, we were also questioned that DPI is supposed to be sector agnostic, but the realization has been that if you want to implement DPIs in a particular sector, you need to look at the nuances of the sector. You need to understand the people in the sector. I see questions in the chat about farming subsidies, global south, small and marginal farmers. And those are exactly the reasons why we need DPIs, which are sector specific. Nidhi, if we could move to the next slide. I just have one slide, but I'll try to cover what Open AgriNet in India is about. So we are working with the government of Maharashtra, the project on climate resilient agriculture, which is supported by World Bank. And we are bringing a DPI approach to it. How we are doing it, we have a backend based open transaction network there. We integrate multiple services. A couple of them are listed here when into the and make them interoperable with the backend infrastructure. So we have the database listed with Project on Climate Resilient Agriculture, POCRA, which includes details on market prices, detailed on soil health, and advisory services from package of practice documents from universities. Then we have an AgriStack integration. AgriStack in India includes farmer registries, and farmer registries, when I say farmer registries, it also includes the socioeconomic details of the farmers. It is not just a number given to farmer. It is also about the socioeconomic status, because that is how the benefits are defined. Benefits and subsidies are defined for farmers. It includes the farm ID and the land size that a farmer owns. It will also eventually include the crop that a farmer is growing. We still have the digital crop survey going on in India. Then we are also integrating with multiple departments. Electricity department is listed here because now a farmer, if she or he wants to irrigate his field and is dependent on electricity, how does he know that the electricity, there's going to be a power cut? So linking with the electricity, notifying the farmers about the availability or unavailability of electricity helps them plan the irrigation and other services. Then Maha-DBT, so direct benefit transfer, that is the biggest benefit transfer scheme in Maharashtra. And we have integrated these subsidies under the scheme with our network in Maharashtra. So a farmer can know about the eligibility for different benefits. They can check the status of their of the schemes and subsidies they have applied for through Mahavistar. Then we have a scheme registry, which again gives the farmers details about all the schemes they are eligible under POKRA and other agricultural department. Now, making this available to farmer also requires that there needs to be a language localization. Marathi is the most commonly spoken language in Maharashtra. And when I say local language, language localization, it is not just about developing models in the local language. It is also about understanding the agricultural context. So there are if you visit a field in India or across Africa, farmers have very unique terminologies for diseases, for crops that may not be part of the scientific discourse. If you won't find those terms in university documents, you won't find those terms in any of the agricultural books. So the language needs to be contextualized for agriculture. That's why having sector-specific language models, sector-specific uh, uh, glossaries to ensure that the AI understands not just the local language, but also the context of the domain in which we are discussing. We are making this available to farmers through an interface of their choice. There is an Mahavistar application, there is a website, there will soon be a voice AI layer, because voice is going to be the future, just like touchscreen and where WWW was a couple of years back. This is the lay of the land of Open AgriNet, where we are bringing multiple DPIs like AgriStack, DPT, integrating them through a backend protocol and adding an AI layer to make it more accessible to farmers. Next slide. Yeah. So, and to enable this effort, we are riding on the shoulder of giants. We have Ministry of Agriculture, which is the biggest subsidy provider in India. Vistar, which is the government of India, central government equivalent of Open AgriNet in India, which provides details on schemes from central government. Then AgriStack, which is again by Ministry of Agriculture, which gives the farmer registries, farmer IDs, etc. And at the state level in Maharashtra, we have POKRA and we have Maha-DBT integration. We are also collaborating with the India AI mission, which is providing GPUs for this effort. We are working with Bhashini and AI for Bharat, which are supporting the language models. This exercise has been a culmination of multiple DPIs to in turn create another DPI for agriculture, and using the power of AI to make it more accessible and farmer friendly. Yeah, next slide. I think I'll hand it back to you, Namrata.
Thank you very much, the three of you, and of course, our audience also listening. I do have 3 questions for each of you, and then, of course, I think there are enough questions on the chat, so it might take some time for us to also go over them. Of course, Amy, Nidhi, and Kirti, if you want to use any of the slides to sort of like reiterate your point or emphasize on something, feel free to do that. I think it's just nice to have some face through the questions here. My first question is to Amy, actually. Bringing this back to the why we did the session, which is the paper launch, right? So a question to you has been like, what are some of the patterns that you saw come out of research in terms of non-technical implementation conditions? Like what could facilitate a success of a DPI approach in ag sector or any other sector?
Great. Yeah. Really important. I think, we spent a lot of time just going through what are these actual building blocks and, technically what are they and how might they work together and talking about data standards. But so much of implementation is not about the technology, right? And we can get the technology part right and still have things not come through. And I think throughout the course of working on this, we heard maybe not concerns, but questions, or what about this and what about that? And I think a lot of them kind of came down to thinking about implementation approach. And so I'll just touch on a couple of them here. And again, there's much ink spilled in the white paper that you'll see that goes into them more. But I think one of the first ones, and again, I feel like we're emphasizing this about, but is the idea of cross-sectoral governance and just making sure that as you're investing in kind of sector-specific building blocks and thinking about that sectoral nuance, that it doesn't end up kind of recreating those silos. I don't think we've seen this yet as a problem, but I think it's on the back of a lot of people's minds just because, DPI so much stresses foundational use case and kind of averting fragmentation. And I think, as we talked to different implementers and thought about this, it's really about engaging stakeholders across the government in this process, right? So, I mean, Kirti in her example even mentioned, talking about Ministry of Electricity, right? Like not typically who you're going to talk to in ag, but recognizing that lives stretch over sectors and that as you build particular resources and components within a sector, doing it in concert with a broader developing digital ecosystem is really important. So whether that's working with Ministry of ICT or a presidential initiative, or depending on how the country is set up, just thinking about reaching out to those stakeholders outside the sector, as you're going along, and also making sure that you're kind of being true to that building block approach of building things to open standards, so that as the broader digital ecosystem develops and there are more of these cross-sectoral resources to connect to, you can do so, right? And you haven't done something within the sector that really isn't extensible or able to be utilized by others. Another one I'll touch on, and I think I saw a question of this in the chat, is market shaping, right? And what are some of the incentives to actually encourage stakeholders to utilize common components when many people have a system already, right? Like agriculture has been thriving for certain people. It's not like there's nothing out there already. And so I think, we heard a lot about the importance of what can be done to encourage private sector, to encourage other stakeholders to use these new common components, whether those are public-private partnerships or specific policy things. For example, making sure that the DPI component offers some kind of benefit over the alternative. Like if we're thinking about the data exchange platforms, offering quality assurance or standards compliance, or some quality check so that there's value associated with using the component that you may not get from alternatives. It could be things like the public sector guaranteeing demand for products that are offered through an open discovery network, right? So you get some sort of guaranteed buyout for using that network versus one that might be more fractured. Or conditioning supply chain contracts on the use of a common traceability standard, right? Some of these things that can just pull the ecosystem in the direction that you want to go can be really helpful in moving that forward. And then maybe I'll just touch on one more here and we can come back to it in question if there are other ones. I think it's also important just to highlight the building of an evidence base. So as we started this discussion, we noted that it's still early days for many countries in developing DPI and certainly in developing these sector-specific ecosystems on top of that. And there's a lot of desire, especially from governments, to say, okay, well, what is the cost benefit? What is the impact I can expect? And I think, we're still definitely building that out, right? There aren't, especially within the sector, really strong, comprehensive, here's the entire picture, the slide graphic that we put with all of those layers and everything there is still and largely probably will be, conceptual and idealistic, but that's the direction we're moving in. And I think at this point, what's really important is thinking about how are we going to measure that? What are the impacts that we want to measure? Are you starting to think and collect cost data in a structured way that will allow that kind of evidence base to be built going forward? Because these are very large investments and they're long-term investments and they are expensive for countries. And I think having that evidence base is going to be more and more important over time. So I'll pause there, and again, happy to come back to the topic if there's time later.
Of course, I think we have some questions that you might be able to come back to, but I'm going to pivot to Nidhi on just also understanding that you come from the World Bank, from a funder perspective. What might, when and where should, say, from a country perspective, invest in such approaches?
Great. Thank you, Namrata, and also thank you to everyone who's sent questions in the chat, and please do continue to send those. I think I want to start out by saying I know we've spoken a lot about DPI and the value and benefits of digital tools, but all of us believe that DPI, is a means, not the end, and not the starting point. And by this, I mean that all digital tools, including DPI, should not be the objective. And rather, the focus should always be on what are the real challenges, in this case, in the agriculture sector, that we are trying to solve. And so these can be inefficiencies in subsidy delivery, lack of market access, or low yields, whatever the context determines. But starting on what these challenges are, countries, donors, private sector organizations, civil society can then determine what are the potential solutions and whether DPI is the right solution to address this challenge. And I think this is important because, of course, in theory, any country can benefit from DPI and its characteristics. But, in a resource-constrained world, every investment comes at a cost of another. And so countries need to weigh kind of the trade-offs carefully. And there might be cases, where even an analog intervention may be more appropriate than investing in foundational DPI. So, I mean, I want to say that as framing, but as, countries and communities are thinking about, is DPI a good solution? I would also urge them to look at, a return on investment or some cost benefit analysis. And we discuss a framework for this in our paper as well, and kind of lay out potential benefits and costs. Amy has spoken to many of these benefits, but I mean, just to recap them in terms of financial benefits, DPI can reduce leakages and admin costs for government and the private sector, but also time and convenience costs for individuals. And we have seen this, in India's switch to direct bank transfers for fertilizer subsidies. The estimates are that about, $2 billion was saved in these subsidy programs. And so the savings can be huge. Similarly, productivity gains are possible, which of course are linked to financial benefits, but given the challenges we face today in food security are worth highlighting individually as well. And we've seen, emerging examples. For example, in Zambia, there's a digital choice-based model which increased competition among payment providers, kind of lowering prices and expanding rural coverage. And I mean, apart from, financial and productivity gains, of course, there's social benefits. And so DPI can provide more inclusion, improved welfare, and you see, diversity of diets because of digital payments, or you see more inclusion of women as well because of digital payments. But of course, all these benefits depend heavily on adoption, what is the participation from the private sector, and these need to be complemented by often analog interventions, either extension services in agriculture or even incentive programs or advertising components. And we've talked a lot about the benefits, but there are also costs that are associated with these interventions. And for example, India has spent, I think, over $130 million on marketing and incentives to drive the adoption of Aadhaar and UPI. And again, this is an estimate of what they've spent on this. And the digital agriculture mission that the government has rolled out has allocated over $1 billion in infrastructure and rollout across the central and state levels. And there, of course, there are fixed costs that are involved with a DPI, but there are also ongoing costs of maintaining registries, APIs, trust frameworks, and so on that need to be considered. And there are also potential costs of, like social risks, such as exclusion that could have a significant impact. that need to be managed. So, I mean, to answer the question more directly, any country, of course, could benefit from DPI and its principles, but it's about the right time, the right opportunity. And I would say start always with a strong, feasible use case that has the potential to scale, demonstrate value, and then you can move on to thinking about a larger ecosystem. And I think Kirti's example also kind of points to that, where once you can demonstrate value, especially for emerging concepts, it's easier then to build momentum on that. And I mean, all of this also to say, like Amy said, that all of this depends on the policy and infrastructure ecosystem. We've talked a lot about the technological aspects of this, but you need a certain amount of digital maturity, basic connectivity, phone frameworks, digital literacy, depending on what you're looking at. And what is crucially important is political commitment and government and governance capacity. And I think there was a question also in the chat about, what are the incentives that you could look at? And we have seen a lot of governments go into more digital systems, but, the political commitment, the timing are so crucial. And sometimes it's also external events that play a role, whether, with COVID-19, we saw a huge increase in digital payments across the world. And these things matter a lot. How you frame it, priorities, we've seen with digital IDs in India has mattered a lot. So, I mean, we can talk more about that later, but just to emphasize that is absolutely crucial in determining when countries should invest in DPI and what kind of DPI as well, the use case, but also these political and ecosystem aspects.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The next question is actually to Kirti. I'm going to piggyback on one of the questions that's also on the chat. That way we're covering everything within the time. I think we've already taken up some questions. Thanks, both of you. To Kirti, also knowing that from OAN we worked largely with small and marginal farmers, what are some learnings from such implementation actually with Mahavistar? And what does support look like for this category of farmers when you do DPI adoption or DPI dissemination?
I think the biggest learning is, both Nidhi and Amy have also highlighted, you start by doing a lay of the land. You understand what are the pain point of the farmers and is DPI needed? So is DPI needed? Yes, we have a lot of fragmentation in agriculture. And if you want to reach the small and marginal farmers, maybe the traditional tools may not serve because given the extension to farmer ratio in India and other multiple challenges in agriculture, you need a foundational infrastructure which can enable services for farmers. Aside from that, what has been important for us is to identify complementarities. Not all farmers want digital solution, but where can a DPI or a solution like Open AgriNet help? Can they enable or empower extension workers to make them more relevant for farmers? For example, what we are trying to do under Open AgriNet is identifying in what are the major queries or pain points that farmers are facing in a region. And if it is exceeding a certain threshold, so prioritizing extension workers and the farming assistants focus over there. So this way the physical interface remains, and while digital is serving the role of empowerment. And aside from that, governance, policy is one part of the whole thing that cannot be and should not be ignored. We are dealing with small and marginal farmers. We are working, and most of them have entrusted the government and these infrastructure with their personal data. So we need to act responsibly. We need to make sure that the governance system is watertight to be able to preserve and their privacy and adhere to the data privacy norms. And yes, a use case, identifying the use case that has the maximum bang for the buck, because you want these DPIs to sustain. If we try to solve a use case which does not have much traction, which does not serve the need of majority of farmers, the amount of initial investments versus the returns that are coming that might not match. So we need to have the right use case which serves the majority of the farmers, right? For India and most of the African states, subsidy is a major part of the agriculture ecosystem. Farmers are heavily dependent on government for subsidies. How can we create these DPI rails for farmers and enable subsidies for them? Then also another part is integrating with the other DPIs like AgriStack, and I see a question on transaction in the chat. So can ENAM and ONDC enable transaction, because most of the state governments won't be able to take up the marketing and the supply chain logistic part of it. So can we have a last mile connectivity with players like ONDC or an ENAM, which can help the farmers reach the market? So yes. So finding the complementarities and ensuring sustainability, that's what I would say.
Thank you. I'm quickly going to comb through the questions and see what might not already be addressed in the presentation, and then we could maybe address those. I think the first question was taken up by Kirti in the context level specificity of AI and how even if it's sector agnostic, things sometimes need more context. I think Ganesh's questions has already been answered. The CTA will come to in the end, traditionally how CTA is done. I think Vinay's and is also answered. Okay, maybe the one question I see, either of you could feel free to take it, of course. Who builds the components of a DPI? How do you choose between an open source and a proprietary? I'll mix some questions here. If you go open source, then how do you balance that with innovation or private sector innovation, which is also another question. So how do you balance that between profitability and ventures in the same sector at the same time, like to the values of DPI is like what is DPI for public good and why somewhere or where will open source make more sense? Either of you feel free to take, or of course all of you can take, but
I can share some opening thoughts, and please feel free to jump in. I mean, I think the framing here is a familiar tension for those working in digital public goods and thinking about open source products, right? And I think what we're trying to get at with the concept of DPI and recognizing that many of what we've called out as building block components might be operationalized through a particular product that might be a DPG, right? Is that a lot of this benefit comes from not having to recreate those over and over again, right? And being, if not open, but at least being standards based so that it's not, so that others can build to it, right? Particularly with some of those data assets, they don't necessarily have to be open for free. They could be open with a license. They could be open for some use cases for free. They could be open in different scales. There are different business models around open source products that can help make these sustainable. And I think it's a really important issue because across, just thinking about digital public goods generally, one of the issues that I didn't touch on in the initial question is financial sustainability and thinking about, if you're really successful in getting countries to use open source products, they're not, they might be free without a user license, but they're not free to maintain, right? There's still a cost that goes into core development. There's costs that go into training. There's costs that go into implementation support. And each of these products need some kind of business model to make them sustainable in the long term, which is in everybody's interest when they become part of a country's ecosystem. And so I think, part of this is about how do we think about, value added models? How do we think about, keeping the core component that allows these different components to work together, open and accessible, but then obviously people are going to tailor and build on top of and add additional features and things that can add value in ways where you'll have different business models around it. So I don't think this is a settled question. I think everybody agrees that it's a challenge and there are lots of different ways that people are exploring addressing it. There are a couple of resources in the white paper around thinking about total cost of ownership and different business models for open source products that are going to continue to be important. But I think it's recognizing that there does need to be some, right, to make sure that these remain valued products, and that there are different ways being explored in the ecosystem to do that. You can keep kind of the base open and still have different value adds on top of that. Nidhi, Kirti, if you want to add.
I mean, Amy, I think you've answered that beautifully. I think just to emphasize this, the question that asks about financial sustainability of funding is so crucial. And I think, because the DPI field is still nascent, we've not fully come to terms with the long-term implications maybe of financial sustainability in this field. But there are, different approaches, and we're thinking of a kind of reusable building block model across countries. So can we build modules specific for agriculture that sit on top of, DPI that can be plugged and play across different contexts with some customization? Now, this is a hypothesis which we need to test out, but that's one way to look at it. But then there's also the tension between home built systems versus plug and play models. And so it is an evolving landscape in where there might be certain models that are more cost effective, but there might be also more incentives specific governments might have for building their own systems. And I think our role here is to think about what are all the various approaches that are possible. And ultimately, because these things are so politically driven and context specific, leaving it to specific governments apart from kind of good practices that we can discuss. And I think that kind of brings us to the point about open source. And there's often a perceived tension between open source and security, where I mean, I think we're trying to move more and more towards open source systems, especially as security protocols have already become better. And this can, of course, lead to more innovation. But, open source is also a large term, and what aspect of a technology is open source also depends, like, it can also create innovation in a certain way. And also then let's just touch upon the point about, or the question on private sector profits versus farmer use. And I think especially in the agriculture sector, you have to be very mindful given the section of population you're primarily focused on. And, the example of India has been discussed in great detail, but I would say like regulation, safeguards, and systems are a non-negotiable in this regard. And the government has a big role to play here in terms of ensuring there's enough regulation, data security, privacy in place where, and if that is the case, there doesn't necessarily have to be a trade-off between profits for companies versus welfare benefits and productivity benefits for, say, smallholder farmers. So there are models where you can have both together and you can balance that, where civil society and government play a crucial role in ensuring they are the guardrails for that and keeping close watch. But I'll pause there because I know time is also of essence now.
Thank you so much, both of you. I also need to apprise that this might be a little late in the evening for India, but this is also very early for Nidhi and Amy, who are taking the call from the States. So, call to action for myself would be that we already have the transcript of the chat. So, I will take the responsibility to put together like a Q&A and then, of course, mail it to our participants here. So, if you feel like your question wasn't responded to or wasn't adequately addressed, please give me 48 hours maximum, then you will definitely receive a response in writing. I hope, Nidhi and Amy, I'm putting this on you on the spot, so I think that's okay. The second call to action, if I may take the liberty to, the major is wait until September 3. There is a paper that's launching. We will send this to you. Of course, you can also find it on Web website, if I'm not wrong, or like on the World Bank website. So the call to action is to actually read the paper. A lot of the questions asked on the chat will be addressed. And of course, there's the second one, which is like, we need a more deep dive. We need time to digest. Maybe once the paper is launched and some of these are still addressed, feel free to write to us, oansocial@cost.org.in, and we will definitely see what can be done to sort of plug any gaps that come after the paper launch, or even like discuss the paper once that's launched and the questions already addressed, maybe like what new comes up. I hope that is okay with all of you. Amy, Nidhi, Kirti, anything to add on final thoughts before I close the call?
Yes, I'll just add a final thought. Saw a question also. So the finances are covered, but one thing that has been rising that I think with the support of World Bank and multiple other not-for-profits is the procurement of services has largely become more on protocols, more on open source and digital public goods. So while the financial models are being figured out, the consortium-based approach to DPIs is leading to increasing awareness, and most of the countries are migrating towards open solutions. So that's giving a big push. And yeah, that's what has been seen in the RFPs also, where, like somebody has mentioned in the chat. So yeah, thanks.
Nidhi and Amy, any final thoughts before we decision?
No, great. Thank you so much. Just to say, the paper's not quite live yet. There should be a session, as Nidhi mentioned, at the Africa Food Systems Forum, and we can circulate after the formal launch. So then thanks again to everyone for joining, and to Nidhi and Kirti and the whole OAN community for being part of its development.
I think just to add to that again, just a huge thank you from our end to the collaborators as well as everyone in the community. I think this has really been, like I said, a joint effort, and it's going to be an ongoing joint effort. And I hope we can continue the journey together. So thank you very much.